The assumption was simple: this must belong to someone from Brookhaven's past, maybe a missing person, maybe someone who'd fallen into the well long ago. But when detectives ran the DNA through local databases, the results came back chilling. No match. Not to anyone in town, past or present. The town's fear. That night, whispers turned into panic. Brookhaven was the kind of place where secrets didn't stay buried for long, except now, apparently, they had. Some said it must be the work of an old murderer, someone who'd lived among them for years, hiding in plain sight. Others whispered about cult activity, pointing out strange symbols carved into stones near the well that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. And a few began to panic about something much darker: if the skull didn't match anyone in town, maybe it wasn't even human. Suspense built. Detectives doubled down. They brought in anthropologists and bone specialists. The results were conclusive: the skull was definitely human. It belonged to a young woman, likely in her 20s, dead for at least 40 years. But there was no record of a missing woman from that era. None of the town elders remembered anyone vanishing. Families who had been there for generations swore that no one from their bloodline was ever lost. It was like this skull had appeared from nowhere. And then came the most unsettling discovery of all: the inside of the well showed scratch marks. Not from animals. Not from tools. From human fingernails, dragging desperately against stone. If you think this story is dark already, trust me, it only gets darker. In a moment, you'll hear what investigators uncovered in that well, and why it still haunts Brookhaven to this day. So stay with me, because you do not want to miss what happens next. When investigators widened their search around the well, they found something buried in the mud just a few feet away, something that made even the most seasoned detectives step back in shock. Because it wasn't just a skull in that well. It was part of something much bigger. Echoes beneath the water. The discovery of that skull at the bottom of the well had already fractured the peace of the town. At first, whispers spread cautiously, neighbors talking to neighbors, people lowering their voices in shops. But soon, the entire community was buzzing like a hive disturbed. Everyone wanted to know, who was the skull in the well? The police had cordoned off the site, pulling out the remains carefully. The well, which had been on an abandoned farmstead at the far edge of town, suddenly became the most visited place in the county. Reporters showed up. Crime scene tape fluttered in the wind. And yet, nothing added up. The skull didn't match any missing person report from the town or even the surrounding counties. No one claimed it. And when investigators sent it off for forensic testing, the results came back strange: the skull was old. Not ancient, but not recent either. It had been there for years, maybe decades. That was the first red flag. But here's where it gets even more unsettling: the well itself wasn't supposed to exist. When the property records were dug up, something shocking appeared. Every map, every blueprint, and every document about that land showed no well. No structure, no water source, nothing. Yet there it was, a weathered stone circle hidden in the weeds, with a skull lying at the bottom. So naturally, the townspeople began asking, who built the well, and why was it never recorded? If you're hooked right now, imagine being in that town, hearing that the police found a skull in a well that shouldn't exist. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you question whether this was a crime, or something much darker. The investigators had little to go on, so they turned to the town's archives. Old newspapers, dusty ledgers, oral histories, anything that could connect the land to the skull. That's when they stumbled onto the first truly eerie clue. Buried in an 80-year-old newspaper was a small column titled, "Disappearance on Old River Road." The article described a farmhand named Daniel Rourke who vanished without a trace in 1943. He had been working on that very property. Witnesses said he was last seen carrying buckets of water from the woods, but here's the problem: the nearest water source was over a mile away. Unless there had been a secret well. This gave police their first working theory, that the skull might belong to Daniel Rourke. But there was a problem: Daniel had family still living in town. His granddaughter, now an old woman, swore her grandfather's body had been buried in the cemetery decades earlier. She claimed she had even attended the funeral. So how could his skull be in the well? Unless the coffin had been empty. The investigation only got weirder from there. While combing through the property again, detectives noticed something odd near the base of the well, faint carvings, like someone had tried to scratch words or symbols into the stone. But years of erosion had nearly erased them. Forensic imaging revealed fragments of letters, an R, an O, and what looked like the start of a word, ROUR. It looked like someone had tried to etch Daniel's name into the stone. But here's where the story takes a turn. The forensic team did a full skeletal analysis. And it revealed something chilling: the skull belonged to a woman. Not Daniel. Not any man. And that single fact blew the case wide open. The atmosphere of fear. When the news hit, the town spiraled into paranoia. Who was she? Why had no one reported her missing? And if it wasn't Daniel in the well, then who was in Daniel's grave? Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the skull belonged to a drifter, a nameless traveler who crossed paths with the wrong person. Others whispered that the well was cursed, that it had been swallowing souls long before anyone discovered it. But then, a farmer stepped forward with a story that would darken everything. He claimed that as a child, he and his friends had been dared to go to the old farmstead one night. They had wandered near the woods, laughing, until they came upon the stone well. He swore he saw something strange, a woman in white, standing at the edge of the well, her hair dripping wet. When they blinked, she was gone. At the time, everyone dismissed it as childhood imagination. But after hearing about the skull, he began to wonder if it had been something else, someone else. Warning: what would you have done if you were in that town, hearing these whispers of ghosts and curses tied to a real skull pulled from the earth? Make sure you keep listening, because the truth behind this mystery is far more terrifying than a ghost story. A town divided. At this point, the investigation took two diverging paths. On one side were the police, treating the case like a homicide from the past. They believed the skull was evidence of a long-forgotten murder, possibly tied to Daniel Rourke or his descendants. On the other side were the townspeople, who began treating the well as something more sinister. Candles were left at its edge. Flowers appeared overnight. Some even began whispering prayers, convinced the well was a resting place for the restless dead. And then came the breaking point. A second bone was found. This time, not in the well, but buried just a few feet. Forensic testing confirmed it, a longer person than the skull. Which meant, there were at least two bodies connected to this well. The town panicked. Parents forbade their children from walking near the woods. The media swarmed the area, calling it the Well of Bones. And investigators began to suspect something horrifying, that this was not just a murder site. It could have been a dumping ground. A flicker of truth. But then, another clue emerged, one so bizarre it pushed the mystery into new, unsettling territory. In the attic of the farmhouse, hidden beneath rotting floorboards, they found a locked chest. Inside were yellowed letters, brittle with age. Each one was signed only with the initials Dr. Daniel Rourke. The letters were disturbing. They spoke of voices in the night, of water that called to him, and of something he could never resist, the pull of the well. And at the end of one letter was a phrase that chilled investigators. She is down there. She will never leave me. Who is she? And did that mean Daniel himself had put the skull in the well? If you think this is chilling so far, wait until you hear what investigators discover next. It's the kind of revelation that makes you look twice at every ordinary place you thought you knew. Stick with this. The more they read, the darker the picture became. The letters hinted at a secret relationship, one Daniel wasn't supposed to have. A woman who, for some reason, couldn't be acknowledged publicly. He described her in passionate detail, but also with fear, like he both loved her and dreaded her. And then, suddenly, the letters stopped. No more mentions of her. No closure. Just silence. It was as if she had been erased. And then came the final twist of forensics dated the skull. It belonged to a woman who had died sometime in the 1940s. The exact decade Daniel had vanished. And though no one could prove it yet, the implication was clear: the skull might belong to the woman in Daniel's letters. But if that was true, why had Daniel been buried in the town cemetery with a coffin his family swore was filled? Unless someone switched the bodies. And if that's the case, who was in Daniel's grave? The coffin that lied. The town was now divided between two fears. One group whispered about a curse tied to the well, claiming it swallowed souls and trapped them underground. The other group believed something much darker, that the land itself had been the site of murder, and the well was nothing more than a secret graveyard. But the real test was about to begin. The police petitioned the courts for permission to exhume Daniel Rourke's grave. It wasn't a decision they made lightly. Digging up the dead in a small town, especially someone with surviving family, is a line you don't cross unless you have a very good reason. The court granted the order. And so, on a foggy morning, under the watchful eyes of townspeople who gathered like it was a grim spectacle, the earth above Daniel's grave was broken open. The smell of soil and damp would fill the air as workers pried open the coffin. But what they found silenced everyone. The coffin wasn't empty. Inside lay a skeleton. But it wasn't Daniel's. The forensic team quickly confirmed what no one wanted to hear: the bones inside the coffin belonged to a woman. Which meant two horrifying possibilities. One, either Daniel's family had buried the wrong body all those years ago, or two, someone had deliberately switched the remains, concealing the truth of what happened to Daniel. A shocking realization. When investigators compared the bones in the coffin to the skull found in the well, their stomachs dropped. The two didn't match. Which meant the town was dealing with two women. One in Daniel's grave. One in the well. And still, no Daniel. The case had officially become something else entirely: a missing man and two dead women. If you followed this story so far, you can see why people were terrified. A missing man. Two unidentified women. And a hidden well that wasn't supposed to exist. Make sure you stay to the end, because the discovery that's coming will completely rewrite this entire mystery. The letters found in the farmhouse suddenly took on a much darker meaning. Investigators now believe that Daniel had not only been in a secret relationship with a woman, but that there might have been two women connected to him. And the key to unlocking the truth came from the granddaughter, the one who swore she had attended Daniel's funeral. She revealed something her family had never told outsiders. On the day of Daniel's burial, his wife at the time insisted on a closed casket. Everyone thought it was just because his body had been badly decomposed. But what if that was a lie? What if his wife had known the coffin didn't contain Daniel? The diary. In a stunning twist, Daniel's wife's personal belongings, long since donated to the Historical Society, were combed through for evidence. And tucked away in a brittle leather diary, they found a passage that made everyone's skin crawl. It read, "She will not stop coming here. She waits for him at the well. I cannot bear the sight of her any longer." The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. But it revealed two things. Daniel's wife knew about her. And she connected her to the well. Investigators pieced together a disturbing theory. Daniel may have been having an affair with a woman who either lived near or was somehow tied to the well. When she wouldn't stop coming around, something violent happened. But then, who was the second woman? The one in Daniel's coffin? The spiral of fear. By now, the town was in a frenzy. People started leaving candles not just at the well, but also at Daniel's grave. Children were told to avoid walking past the cemetery at night. And then came a story from one of the oldest residents of the town, a man in his 90s. He said that, as a boy, he remembered hearing arguments late at night near the Rourke farmhouse. Not between Daniel and his wife, but between Daniel and two women. He claimed he heard shouting, then silence, then the sound of something heavy being dragged across the dirt. And then, the splash of water. He never told anyone, because as a boy, he assumed it was a nightmare. But after hearing about the skull, he knew it wasn't. The well's secret. Convinced that the well held more than one secret, police brought in ground-penetrating radar. What they found was staggering. The soil around the base of the well showed multiple disturbances, as if the ground had been dug up and filled again, more than once. Investigators decided to dig further. And just a few feet below where the skull had been pulled, they unearthed fragments of a second skeleton. This one wasn't complete, just broken bones scattered at the bottom. But it was enough to confirm what they had feared: the well had been used to hide bodies. Imagine being in that town now, realizing the well wasn't just an accident of history, it was a graveyard. If this story grips you, make sure you stick around, because the next revelation is the one that shattered the town forever. The pattern. Forensic dating of the bones painted an even darker picture. One woman's remains were from the 1940s. Another from the 1950s. This meant the deaths didn't happen all at once. They were spread out over time. Which raised the question, was Daniel Rourke really the killer, or had the well been used by someone else after him? The farmhouse changed hands multiple times after Daniel vanished. Families moved in and out. The land sat abandoned for years at a stretch. Anyone could have used that well to hide a body. And yet, every clue, from the initials on the letters, to the diary, to the timing, kept circling back to Daniel. It was as if the story of the well and the women was inescapably tied to him. The breakthrough. Then, just as the case seemed like it might collapse under the weight of too many unanswered questions, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place: the state archives. A researcher digging through census records found something odd. In the 1940 census, Daniel Rourke was listed as head of household, living with his wife. But in the 1941 census, a new name appeared under the same address: Margaret Hale. The records listed her as a domestic helper. No one in town had ever heard of her. There were no descendants, no obituary, no marriage, no burial. She simply appeared in the census once, and then vanished from history. Investigators now had a name to put to one of the women. And when they compared Margaret Hale's documented age and physical description to the skull, it matched almost perfectly. Margaret was the woman in the well. This is the point in the story where everything turns upside down. Because now investigators had identified one of the women. But what they didn't realize was that uncovering Margaret's name would unlock a truth about Daniel Rourke that no one in town was prepared for. Stay with me, what comes next is the most chilling part of all. The townspeople reeled at the revelation. If Margaret Hale had been living with Daniel, what had happened to her? Why had no one ever mentioned her existence? And why had her name been buried in census records no one had bothered to check for 80 years? There was one more chilling detail in the census entry. Next to Margaret's name, in faded ink, was the occupation line. And written there, in careful handwriting, was one word: companion. Not maid. Not helper. Not worker. Companion. It suggested something far deeper than employment, something personal. Which meant Daniel's letters about her were almost certainly about Margaret Hale. But if she was in the well, and another woman was in his coffin, then what happened to Daniel himself? That answer, as investigators would soon discover, was far darker than anyone in town could have imagined. The man who never left. For months, the town had lived under the shadow of the well. A missing farmer. 2 dead women. A coffin filled with lies. And now, finally, investigators had a name: Margaret Hale. The census had proved she lived with Daniel Rourke, and the forensic results tied her skull to the well. But the question lingered: if Margaret was the woman in the well, then who was the woman in Daniel's grave? A terrible clue. The answer came from the county coroner's office. When they examined the bones pulled from Daniel's grave more closely, they noticed something shocking. The skeleton showed signs of childbirth. Which meant the woman buried in Daniel's coffin was a mother. But Daniel's wife had only ever given birth once, his son, who later left the town. And that son's birth records proved his mother had lived into her 60s, dying of natural causes years later. So who was this woman in the coffin? The coroner found one more grim detail: the woman's pelvic bones suggested she had given birth multiple times. Not once. Not twice. At least 3 times. Which meant she wasn't Daniel's wife. But she might have been someone else's. Backhand index pointing right, this is where things get disturbing. If you've made it this far, you have to hear the end, because the truth behind this grave will leave you with more questions than answers. The letters revisited. Remember the letters signed Dr.? They didn't just talk about Margaret Hale. Some of them also mentioned a sister. A woman who came to the farm with her children, who stayed for weeks.